Welcome to week 3 of the Parables class. Great to have you back. Hopefully you've been enjoying the first 2. And this week we're going to look at a parable that's been called the parable of the Shrewd Manager. This parable, unlike the one that we saw last week, is one that you might not be as familiar with. But like the parable of the Good Samaritan, the context of this parable really gives us an important clue into what it's about. I'll tell you what it's about. It's about money. Jesus talked more about money than he talked about sexuality, more than he talked about heaven and hell, more than he talked about prayer. All of those things combined, Jesus talked more about money, and because of that, half of the parables are about money or possessions. And so it's appropriate for us to be looking at a parable that addresses it. And if that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, a little squeamish, that's okay. That's a good thing. Jesus is going to press in his truth and wants to speak to us. So I'm going to read the parable from Luke chapter 16. If you want to follow along in your Bibles, you can do that. And then we'll watch the modern rendition of this parable. So hear this from Luke chapter 16. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this manager was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master's taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you,' Jesus said, 'make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings.' Jesus went on to say, 'One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money.' Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, 'You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God.'" So enjoy this modern rendition of the parable of the shrewd manager, and we'll come back and discuss it together.
Come, you ladies and gentlemen, listen to my song. Sing it till you're right, but you might think it's wrong. May make you mad, but I mean no harm. It's just about the renters on Penny's farm. It's hard times in the country, out on Penny's farm. You move out on Penny's farm, plant a little crop of tobacco and a little crop of corn. Come around, see, don't flit and fly, till you get yourself a mortgage on everything you got. It's hard times in the country, out on Penny's farm. And George Penny got a flattery mouth, move you to the country in a little log house. Got no windows but the cracks in the wall. They work you all the summer and rob you in the fall. It's the hard times in the country, out on Penny's farm.
Well, let me ring you back here in a minute, all right? Okay. Well, I guess you know why I want to see you. Jasper, you've been with us here now for, what, 5 years now? No, 6. 6 years. You got a lot of things going for you. You're a smart young man. You know how to handle people. And you're good with the books. So, I don't particularly want to be doing this. But we are running a business here. 53,000 acres. Now that's quite a bit of soil. We got renters whose livelihoods depend on me keeping things fair and square. On you keeping things fair and square. Jasper, dadgummit, how could you keep on doing it? Did you think I wouldn't hear about it? Well, heck, every time I go down to eat at Blue and White, someone's coming up and telling me some story about how Jasper's mismanaging the farm's property. Well, this time you've gone too far. Jasper, look at me. Look at me. Do you think I was just going to sit on my fat behind and turn a blind eye to your what did you say about what old Johnson? About what old Johnson was doing to Jim Gleason last month? Misappropriation of resources. Is that what you call what you've been up to? Huh? Misappropriation of resources? Misappropriation of my foot. There's another word for it, and we both know what it is. Stealing. Plain and simple. Well, you got to say for yourself. Richard says that I ought to go to Sheriff Williams about it. Says the law ought to know. He's right. Sheriff wouldn't take too kindly to the kind of dealings you've been up to. But I told him that wasn't necessary. My farm, I guess I can do what I want with it. All right then. I'm gonna get the accounting books, and when you get back, you be sure to give Lois those truck keys. Now I don't want to hear another word about it. I've done made up my mind. We can't tolerate that kind of behavior around here. Dadgummit, I'm supposed to be over at Doc Richards' office. Well, you know what you got to do, so go on and get to it. Lois, what in the world are you doing not telling me about my doctor's appointment?
Well, Mr. Jennings, you always tell me not to interrupt you, and when you say not to interrupt you,
I
you mean that...
I know. I'll be back in about an hour or so.
All day, way after night, but you get no pay. Promise some meat or a little bucket of lard. It's hard to be a renter on Penny's farm. It's hard times in the country, out on Penny's farm.
Judgment Day has finally come. I know, you told me I'd get it in the end. This is just terrible. What are we gonna do? Can't go back to driving a combine again. Everyone knows what happened down in Springfield. Well, Frank, I ain't gonna start begging, so don't even mention it. No. You're just gonna have to think about a way to land us a new job, that's all. Come on. Let's see. Hey. Mr. McGinnis has about 15,000 acres. I could probably use a good manager like me. No, but he'll start talking to Mr. Jennings, and after that, there's ain't a snowball's chance he'd bring me on. I guess we're gonna have to move back to Cookville and work in the shoe factory. Well, how do you expect me to find another job around here? It's not like folks owe me any favors. Yeah, Rosalind? Yeah, this is Jasper. Is Mr. Jennings there with Doc Roberts? Oh no, don't bother him. How long do you expect he'll be down there? Oh, he's getting warts removed, and he's got a lot of them. Yeah. So about an hour or so. Well, yeah. Well, don't worry about telling him I called. Yeah, I'll just talk to him when he gets back to the office. Yeah.
Here's a brand new song, folks, taking us straight up to news time. Called
Uh-oh.
No Letters in the Mail.
Frank, I think I got this figured out. I think folks around here are gonna be real happy to have Jasper Crooks around when I finish up with this. Hey, Mr. Rollins. It's Jasper Crooks here. Yes, sir, I'm doing fine. Yes, sir, Frank Pulver's fine too, thank you. Sir, I've got something pretty important to talk to you about. Something I think you're going to be real happy to hear. Oh, no, I can't talk about it over the phone. Yeah, if you could just come on over here to the back house right now, I'll explain it to you then. Oh, yes, sir, it has to be right now. It's kind of a time-sensitive issue.
Well, Crooks, what's so important under God's green earth you can't tell me on the phone? Hey, is Jenny's gonna let me use this combine for free maybe this year?
Thank you for coming over so quickly, sir. Well, Mr. Jennings and me, we got to talking.
Yeah, I'm sure y'all were, yeah, buddy.
Yes, sir, and I was looking through the almanac for this year, and you haven't happened to look through the almanac yet,
Yeah,
have you?
Rogers and I thumbed through it the other day.
So, you know what they're saying about this summer coming up, huh?
Yeah, this summer's supposed to be so hot, the trees are gonna be bribing the dogs.
Yes, sir, but, I showed that to Mr. Jennings, and, me and him got to talking, and we thought it might go a long way towards making things a touch easier on you if we dropped the rent just a little.
You don't say.
Yes, sir. I got the books right here. Now, I recommend it that we drop it $5 an acre.
$5 an acre? Well, what did George say?
Well, he said he thought it'd make it a mighty nicer summer for everyone.
Don't that beat all?
I have here that you've got 3,300 in corn and another 7,800 in wheat. That sound right?
Well, wait just a minute. Let me look. Right here. Yeah, that's it.
So
That's it.
we'll bring it down to $70 an acre, and that should save you.
That'll give me enough to make a deposit on a new combine. You're all right. I don't care what other people say about you. With me, you're all right.
Well, if you'll just sign right here, sir.
Yeah, sure. Where do I sign? Right here?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Sign away. Listen, you need anything. I appreciate the way you're looking out for us.
Yeah.
You're a good man. You're a good man. And, son, this is big. This is big. I tell you what, you take this, and you know your little dog, Frank?
Yeah.
You buy Frank a nice steak dinner, know what I mean? And take care of him. By the way, where is George?
Oh, he's out till late this afternoon.
That's all right. I'll see him down at the Blue and White tomorrow. Buddy, we're going to have a good year.
$5 an acre. $5 an acre. Well, now, George don't drink nothing stronger than Coca-Cola, so that ain't it. $5 an acre? Are you sure?
Yes, sir. And if you'll just confirm these numbers, 4,500 with corn, 3,300 with beans, and 5,200 with wheat.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Well, heck, Jasper, I'll tell you, Georgia finds out about this. Y'all gonna have a pie in here every week, fresh, I guarantee you. She'll cook you a pie.
Well, Miss Gleason does make a mighty mean Cairo nut pie.
She does, yes, she does. My goodness, man. Jasper, son, you have done it.
Oh.
You just have done it. Now, of course, I don't use that almanac that much. Everybody knows that it's right about as much as it is wrong, but yes, sir, you have done it.
Well,
yeah.
if you'll just sign these numbers, confirm it.
Right here?
Yeah.
Yeah. And hey, listen, Jasper, next time you come to the house, I want you to stop in. I got some of Johnson's old shine left. I'll put you back a couple of jugs. Oh, yeah. Now, just make sure old Frank don't drink much of it. And hey, look, you let me know anything else I can do for you. I mean, hear me? Anything. Georgia ain't gonna believe this. She just ain't gonna believe this. Thank you, son.
Yeah, George Penny is coming to town with a wagon load of peaches, not a one of them sound. Gotta have his money or somebody's check. Paying for a bushel and you don't get a peck. It's a hard times in the country out on Penny's farm.
Always welcome.
George Penny's men, they're coming to town with their hands in their pockets and their head hanging down. Go in the store and the merchant will say, your mortgage is due and I'm looking for my pay. It's a hard times in the country out on Penny's farm.
George, I could just kiss you.
Georgia?
Jim called and told me what you did, and I think it's just so wonderful. You know how it is. You haven't forgotten. And with Jimmy going off to college this year, it's going to make such a big difference. George, you are such a good man. Thank you. Thank you.
Lois, get me Jasper on the phone. Jasper, what in the Sam Hill's been going on around here? George, you're the greatest. Mickey and Martha Owen. Jasper, boy, you better start talking.
It's been nice working for you, Mr. Jennings. I'll give Lois the key.
Stop. Now, you ain't going nowhere till I figure out what you've been up to. Why does everybody suddenly think I just hung the moon?
Best take a look at the books.
Jasper, what in the world have you done?
Mr. Jennings, Bill Smythe's son just dropped this off, and he told me to tell you that his daddy said that he had never rented from so generous a farmer, and that Jasper needs a raise. What'd you do, drop the rent?
Thank you, Lois. Give us a minute here, please. How much you drop it?
Just 5.
George Jennings. Oh, John. Yeah, that's right. 5 an acre. Well, yes, that is mighty generous of me, isn't it? This Friday night? New steakhouse in Springfield. Well, that's mighty nice. Well, no, now, I need to check with Jenny first. Yeah, I can let you know tomorrow. All right, then. Bye-bye. If I tell them you've already been fired, and they don't get the drop, then they ain't gonna like it. If I don't tell them, and leave it the way it is, then I ain't gonna like it. Then what's $5? Jasper, when the good Lord was passing out gifts, he darn sure didn't short you on brains. Get on out of here.
Down in his pocket with a trembling hand. Can't pay you all, but I'll pay you what I can. Been to the telephone, the merchant make a call. They put you on the chain gang, don't pay at all. It's hard times in the country, out on Penny's farm.
All right. You know why I really like that modern rendition is because last week we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that's a very well-known parable. This one I don't think is as well known. I mean, if I'm just guessing,
I think it's a safe guess.
If you ask people, are you familiar with the parable of the Shrewd Manager? And part of the reason is because it is a little bit challenging to understand what the point is and why Jesus told it. The modern rendition at least helps a little bit. It helped me kind of understand a little bit more what was going on.
Yeah. I think there's some agreement that this is the most difficult parable that Jesus told to understand. So thanks for letting me be a part of the conversation.
Chad's here to answer all the questions and explain it.
Yeah.
So,
but that's actually, could I actually start there?
Yeah.
If you remember, I know I talked about this when you and I talked last about the parables, that one of the purposes of the parables, as Jesus intended when he taught them, was that it would be something. I talked about it being like a pebble in your shoe, something that you just can't shake. You have to, address it right away, kind of figure it out right away, or it sticks with you. And I think this parable really is a great example of that. If you heard this one time, probably 2-3 times, and it takes you a while to put the pieces together. So like you had talked about earlier, it's kind of a sneaky, clever kind of way that Jesus was discipling his disciples, teaching his disciples as they just kind of did life. He'd tell them these stories, and it would stick with them. I think, for days, like a little riddle they're trying to figure out.
Yeah, and the context really does help. We talked last week about the context of the Good Samaritan, parable of the Good Samaritan, that the dialogue that Jesus was having with a lawyer who was asking about how to inherit eternal life, and so the context even that we read helps. It's clear this parable is about money and how we deal with money, our possessions, really the main symbolism, the main metaphor, if you will, of the story is that we are managers. And we can talk about this parable, how that works out, because this manager is not a good manager. He is shrewd, and that is, we got to figure out what that means and how that applies. But at the kind of most base, important level, we're managers, and God's the owner of everything. We're called to manage His stuff. We're called to be, another word is stewards. In the Bible, and something that stuck with me about that is that there's our default kind of way we think about life typically is, what do I do with my stuff? That's kind of the question in our head when we're going around. What do I do with my stuff in life? And a good manager doesn't ask that. Some people think a good manager might ask, well, what do I do with God's stuff? But even that doesn't go far enough. Really, a manager is supposed to ask, what does God want me to do with God's stuff? What does He want me to do with His stuff? Because I'm just a manager, I'm just a steward, and I'm in charge of it. So that's kind of the base. You got to kind of start to understand that. And then this parable really builds into some complexity. But
Yeah, and I imagine we'll get into some of those details, maybe a little more of the complexity. But it's easy to get caught up when we hear this story to get caught up in the dishonest part. And of course, we know God doesn't want us to be dishonest as we manage money, but He does want us to emulate the manager in his shrewdness. But again, it's Jesus' tool to use this kind of unusual route to give us an example of something to emulate. Like you said, in the case of the money, and it shows the importance of money, like you said earlier as well, that Jesus understood the value of what this guy was mishandling. And one of the notes that I had was that for the original audience, an agrarian society would obviously understand a lot of these concepts. They didn't venture far from it, still using a farming metaphor. But an agrarian society would understand that manager-master concept. And that they would also really understand that to mismanage your master's money was a very serious offense. And I imagine to some degree it was common enough to where people knew that it was a serious offense and not something that you would, enter into lightly. So there was a real understanding as people were hearing the story of, that's not a smart move for this manager to do with his master's money.
That's good. It was definitely a good job to have. And Jesus tells some other parables about this idea of like we're stewards, that God, in the parable of the talents, He gives talents and things like that. So it's let's talk a little bit about the parable, and then we can bring in the modern part that helps flesh it out a little bit. So just to kind of explain, because like you said, it takes maybe a couple times. This parable is there's a man who's managing a rich man's wealth, and it's discovered that the manager is being dishonest and likely stealing, skimming off the top, whatever he's doing. And the owner calls him in, fires him, and but then he hatches this scheme to now make other people indebted to him by reducing the bill of these other people who owe the main owner. And as I was watching, I was reminded, as you read the text, it talks about 100 things of oil, 100 things of wheat, and reducing it down to 50 and 80. That represented a significant sum of money. When I watched that, did the calculation of $5 an acre times there was tens of thousands of dollars of reduced income for the owner. Which is why they were so excited when they were told that.
One of the things that I really didn't notice or think about breaking down the story until I watched the modern version, is that there would have been tension in this moment when the master delivers the news to the manager that he's been fired. And the tension would be, you've lost your job, but you're not going to get in any criminal trouble. And I think that's actually a beautiful picture of the mercy that God shows us. And stop me if I'm getting too far here, Brandon, but it means that this manager has a decision to make. He's received mercy, and he has a decision to make. How's he going to handle his relationship with the master now?
Yeah, that's good.
And we see it play out after that.
Yeah, and the parable itself actually is pretty short. And the passage that we read, there's actually a lot of verses after that. Then Jesus goes on to kind of flesh it out. He talks about being trustworthy, that or faithful. If you can be faithful in a little or trustworthy in a little, then you can be faithful in a lot. Or if you can't be trusted in a small amount, what then would why would you be trusted with more? He talks about not serving two masters. He talks about then the Pharisees, who, what I love about that context is the Pharisees loved money. So he knew who he was talking to. He was talking to people who loved, and that certainly applies to us.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to, just like with these other parables, we've talked about getting into it, getting ourselves into the story in such a way that we would have to wrestle with what it was saying, and so we have to admit that we don't like talking about money, and it makes us uncomfortable, and to think that Jesus has something to say about it is kind of a spiritual test.
Sure.
How we deal with money is like it's like a spiritual thermometer.
Yeah.
Taking our spiritual temperature.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Was that a COVID reference or?
COVID reference, yeah. Spiritual laser pointer temperature checker. Yeah.
You mentioned, at least I feel like you did, some of the surrounding passages to this story, and just before this story is actually Jesus telling the story of the prodigal son, which we'll cover in this series. But what I appreciated was, obviously, the way the order in which Jesus spoke was on purpose. So he starts by telling the story of the prodigal son, which, among other things, in regards to money, is just kind of about pride and the acquisition of wealth and using it for yourself. That's kind of part of it. But then this story, I think, is really about greed and wanting to use these resources for yourself. And kind of to your point, money is not evil in and of itself, right? But when it's informed by our pride and by our greed, the way that we use it, then certainly those actions are evil. And I think it's worth mentioning too, Brandon, that to me, it's Jesus's kind of gentleness to acknowledge with me that money has significance and power, but not in a bad way. Like he talked about money so much because it's an important thing, and having the money that you need to, live a relatively prosperous life. I think that's something that Jesus valued, and so he really was pushing his disciples all the time to think wisely about it. We can get mixed up with this idea of Jesus. Telling the rich young ruler to sell all your possessions, that's actually the greatest spirituality. Well, no, he was telling a different lesson. He understood the value and the importance of money. He just wanted it to not be something that we served.
Yeah.
We
talked about the parables are doing multiple things, and ultimately, like all the scriptures, the parables are going to point us to Christ and his work on our behalf. But the other kind of, secondary feature of the parables, if you will, maybe even the main feature, is that they're showing Jesus' way of teaching his disciples, this is what it looks like to live in my kingdom. This is the kind of character, this is the kind of godly living that my people should be expected to produce and or at least to exhibit. And so you're right. It's not. Sometimes we misquote that verse. That we will sometimes people say money is the root of all evil.
Right.
It's not what that verse says. The verse actually says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. So it's about, do you love it? And it's about what is your character involved. So like you were saying, money is ethically neutral.
Right.
But have we developed the character, in this case, from knowing Jesus and being in his kingdom, that would allow us to engage with money in such a way that we don't love it, we don't serve it, we're not a slave to it. And I noticed that what stood out to me as we watched this again was even when the guy is fired and the boss is late, he runs to his doctor's appointment and he goes and steals candy from his drawer. It's just this little picture of his character is not capable of even handling a small situation, an opportunity to steal there. And so when Jesus says, if you can't be faithful in a little, if you can't be trustworthy in a little, if you haven't developed your character to such a degree, then what would make you think that a lot you'd do any different? So that's.
I think this kind of small town, kind of agrarian again, culture and society, which Jesus would have been moving around to all kinds of small towns. And in these small towns, everybody kind of knows everybody, right? And it's pictured in the, that's how you think of a southern town in the United States or just a small town across the country. Everybody knows everybody, and I think it's important in this text to know that for the manager and for the master, the way that they handled their money affected the entire community. And it's to me, it's this beautiful picture of how we handle our money affects lots of different people. It actually has effect but it's not our kingdom, right? It has effect in God's kingdom and God's economy. So when we are, stewarding well the things that he's given us, instead of it just directly benefiting us or impacting us, it actually has the ability to impact a great number of people when we handle it well.
Yeah. John D. Rockefeller, he's not I don't know if he was a Christian, certainly had some less than desirable traits, but he said that, I would not have tithed on my first million if I hadn't first tithed on my first salary, which was $1.50 a week.
Right.
So he had to develop character in order to handle greater good, in order to be a blessing to him, to those around him. And so the character and aspect in this parable that makes it so difficult is that the manager is called shrewd.
Yeah.
The owner commends him for his shrewdness, which is not a word that we probably even use much. So let's talk about that. What is that? How would you define being shrewd, and what about it is Jesus commending in this parable that we should then be shrewd with our money?
I'm glad you went there, because I was thinking the same thing and made a similar note that for me, and I think for us culturally, we hear the word shrewd and it's either mysterious, we don't really have a good understanding of what it means, or it's just kind of unsettling of like, it's not the kind of person I think I should be, or whatever. It's kind of a negative connotation. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge the cultural implication of it. But what I think is interesting is that just as in a Middle Eastern culture, mismanaging someone's money would have been a very serious offense. Shrewdness was actually highly valued. And we could say, among other reasons, because resources were limited, right? There wasn't always, a ton to go around. A bad year might happen or whatever. And so you really had to be shrewd with what you were given. So just a simple definition of shrewdness that I came up with, I didn't come up with it, I looked it up, is having sharp powers of judgment. I think, well, that makes that's more palatable, having sharp powers of judgment. I think we would all say we probably want to be. That's what shrewd is. We probably all want to have sharp powers of judgment, right? We want to understand a situation well. We want to understand the value of the things that we currently possess. We want to understand, the landscape that's in front of us and how to make thoughtful decisions according to it. And so yeah, I do think though that it does require us we really have to embrace this idea and understand it well. And I'd like for us at some point in our conversation to kind of talk about some specifics of shrewdness. But yeah, did you have any thoughts on that, about what it means to be
Yeah, I
shrewd?
Also had to look it up. Merriam-Webster defines shrewd as someone who is marked by clever, discerning awareness, someone who is astute, canny, or savvy.
Yeah.
Which you mentioned it earlier. There's Jesus, and when he tells the parables, we saw it in the parable of the hidden treasure. There's something about the fact the guy found the treasure, buried it again, didn't tell the owner of the land, and bought the land and had it for himself, that you could take some kind of ethical qualms with that, but that's not why Jesus, that kind of wasn't the point. Right. And in the same way, you don't want to get hung up, like you said, with the fact that this man is commended for doing something that was clearly wrong, that he shouldn't have done. But the point, rather, is that what he did, even though it was wrong, was shrewd, and it was cunning. He was smart about it. He was, so even the Jesus, when he explains it, he says, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. And I also thought of Matthew 10. Jesus says, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." So you could define shrewdness as being wise as a serpent, and yet innocent would be the ethical part. Jesus doesn't want to be naive or dumb about how we handle our possessions or how we think about them. We should be shrewd in that way. So that's a way that it's helped me understand it.
Yeah, I think there's a contrast with that idea of being wise as a serpent, gentle as a dove. There's a contrast in the story that we would say be as wise as the shrewd manager, but unlike the shrewd manager, be honest and gentle like a dove would be. So still keep that idea of this manager in your head, but to acknowledge that Jesus actually wants, obviously, an honest manager. You made me think of it earlier with the Rockefeller quote and this idea of people don't just often just walk into money, right? It's someone who's built wealth has done just that. They've built it. It's been something that they've worked at over time, and it's because they've had some savvy. And I think that's a word that has a little more probably cultural relevance to us. That someone who builds wealth. It's a whole long-term process. And then we would even say, and we've talked about this in some previous campaigns, that management of money, you often see the mismanagement of money when someone has a windfall of cash in their life.
Yeah.
So some inheritance, something, if they didn't have much money before and they get some large inheritance, there's a good chance, I'm not saying it's guaranteed to happen, but there's a good chance they're not going to manage it well because they've never learned the tools. They don't have the savvy, the shrewdness. And so I love the picture then between, in this case, kind of the money, with the earthly currency as a symbol of kind of what God's, the kind of invisible, intangible work of God's kingdom.
Yeah.
And the currency that money has outside of its earthly value, the impact that it has to use what we've been given for God's glory.
Yeah, let's you mentioned, let's flesh it out a little bit. Let's talk about, because the parables are, we said in the first week, the parables are stories, they're metaphors that Jesus uses he uses physical realities to explain spiritual truths.
Yeah.
And so this parable is doing the same thing. It's not just that, okay, in case one day you find yourself in this position as a manager of a field. That's not the point of the parable. The point of the parable is something spiritual here. So what is it? We talked about what is shrewdness as a definition, but what does it mean to be spiritually shrewd? And as it's related to possessions and things like that.
Well, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, if there's a right answer. We don't really prep for this much. This is genuine conversation.
Yeah.
I guess what comes to mind is that good spending habits, we would say, good biblical money management is a physical practice that's informed by spiritual realities. Not to create too much overlap there with parables, but I mean, that's kind of that, that how if I'm going to spend my money well, if it's going to be a regular practice in my life, that's going to have to be a heart issue for me, because my heart's too tempted to spend it on myself, my own personal gain, to just kind of build my own personal wealth. And so, yeah, I would say just ultimately, the shrewdness with our physical resources comes from a transformation of our of our very souls, and then in turn, the things that we love and we care about, the things we want to build. It's not about building for ourselves, but building for others, which is part of the picture of the parable, is that the dishonest manager continues he wants to put these people in his debt. So it's really kind of about what they can do for him. Work in God's kingdom, being a shrewd manager in God's kingdom, is about serving others instead of yourself.
Yeah, that's good.
And letting your money do it.
Yeah. I thought of the idea of there's an urgency about how we handle our wealth, because there's an eternal aspect to it. And so Jesus, later on, after the parable, he talks about how don't store up, or in other places in Matthew 6, right? Don't store up treasures in heaven or on earth where moth and rust destroy, but lay up treasures in heaven. And in this parable, and you see it in the video, there really isn't, he has an urgency because he's just lost his job. And this guy, I think he had like an hour while the guy was at the doctor to come up with a plan for his own survival. And so there's part of his being shrewd was he was urgent, and he acted urgently. And secular people get this. Honest secular people, what is your goal? If you don't believe in an afterlife, if you don't believe that there's more to life than just the things that you can enjoy now, then your goal should really be to retire as early as possible so that you can enjoy what you have for as long as possible before you can't enjoy it anymore. And I think in this parable, Jesus is saying, no, there's the way that you think about how you should use your possessions, your money now, has a longer term goal in mind. And there's urgency to use it correctly, because eternity is the stake. It's in the parable, or right after the parable, he says, what does he say? When you use money, he says, when it is gone, right? Use your wealth in such a way, because when it is gone, not if it's gone, but when it's gone. So Jesus is kind of correcting our perspective to realize, okay, that this life is short. And so something that I was thinking about today is that, because my daughters, we both have daughters in fourth grade, and then I have another one in second grade, and they're doing very like early basic math stuff that I'm like remembering. Oh yeah, I did have to learn that one time, and still have to relearn it, like basic fractions, and how what's greater, a fourth or a third, or what have you, and so I was thinking, okay, well, what if you think of it in fractions? Put infinity in the bottom, put infinity in the denominator, and what's 1 over infinity? Well, it's not that much. You say, well, what's 25 over infinity? It's still nothing. All right, well, what's 75 over infinity? What's 100 over infinity? The point is, however long we're going to live on this earth, even if we live to 100, in the perspective of eternity, is so infinitesimally small. So that means that what we do here matters. There's an urgency about it because eternity is real. And so I feel like part of being shrewd is rather than spending all our stuff and our possessions on ourselves so that we can get the most out of it now, here in this life, we realize, no, there's a way in which we can use it where Jesus says we can actually store up treasure in heaven, we can actually store up treasure for eternity. That could be fleshed out more, but that's one way to.
I think if we think about people who manage money well in our current society, one of the titles they might get is someone who hustles, someone who's hungry, And I thought about that with the shrewd manager in this story. He's hungry. He knows he's going to be without a job, and so he has to think quickly, act urgently, not unlike the story of the hidden treasure. He finds this treasure, and what does he do? It's not, let me sit on it for a little while and think about what I want to do. He goes home immediately and knows that he has to acquire this land. Yeah. Same thing for the manager. He understands in that moment, it's finally kind of hit him that he has to act. He's got to do something, in this case, a little bit drastic. The other thing that I think may have been, I don't know, it's not emphasized as much, but I noticed it in the modern parable, is the scene where the trucks are coming in and out. And you realize from the start of the first conversation to the end, it's been kind of the rest of that day. And I think that's a picture, a landholder like that master would have lots of people renting land from him. And I think the point of the text is that it took a lot of work, but he was willing to do it. So there were a lot of people that he met with and negotiated deals with. And that's a picture of getting busy, recognizing in the moment, I've got to act decisively and do whatever it takes. And so he did. It wasn't just kind of one conversation and done. There was a multitude of things that had to happen in his mind for this to get executed, and in a short period of time, before the master would know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and what makes, what behind that urgency, behind that hustling, behind what makes it so important is we're not just talking about money and things, we're talking about people and souls. And Jesus saying to his disciples, I'm going to take what you do and you're now going to be fishers of men, So in the same way, I want you to use your resources in such a way that it has a lasting kingdom spiritual impact. And we're just, that's what it means to be shrewd with our money. And it's according to Jesus, is that we've used it for his kingdom and for his glory, and so that people can hear the gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's really good.
What else stood out to you?
How about we talk about some shrewdness? What does it mean to practically be shrewd? And maybe we could, during our Q&A time, if there's some thoughts on it. Do you mind if I turn the tables and ask you first?
Sure.
What any maybe examples that you've known of? You don't have to tell on yourself, but just stories that you've known of people who were, you would say, shrewd managers of their money.
Yeah, I mean, I've told this illustration before of John Wesley, who, when he made his kind of first income, his first had his first calling, his first job, I think he made like 30 pounds a year in his currency, and he decided that he could live off of 28 pounds, and he gave 2 away. That was the first year. The second year, he made 50 pounds. So he kept 28 and gave 22 away. And naturally, as tends to happen with us, as he got older and his income increased year after year, eventually, he was making, 1,000 pounds, something a year, and giving almost all of it away. And the lesson from that was that he let his generosity and his giving to God's kingdom shape his lifestyle and his standard of living, rather than letting his standard of living shape and affect his generosity and how he gave to the kingdom. So that's always challenged me to think, how much do I really need, and how much do I just spend on frivolous, we could even call it selfish things. Yeah. I don't think Jesus is calling us to a life of poverty, but I do think he's calling us to a life of shrewdness, of being willing to sacrifice for what is most important.
Right.
That whole, show me your checkbook, I'll show you what really matters to you.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, excuse me, that it's the calling of Jesus is one of, I think, like a thoughtfulness, to really think about the decisions that you're making. And I thought about this as you were sharing, that Jesus is not, part of this is a lesson on tithing, but it's not, make sure you position your budget in such a way that you can give your 10%. You've missed the whole idea of how Jesus wants you to, handle money. It's do whatever it takes to give as much as you can. One of the examples that I had was of a guy who actually made a very good living, was actually a physician and was really successful. But he and his family made a commitment to build a pretty conservative budget. And he would say he did whatever was necessary to kind of get some college savings set aside for his kids. And they weren't living in poverty, but for their tax bracket, they were really living a pretty conservative life. And we gave the guy a hard time because he just wore T-shirts all the time, and was never concerned about nice clothes. And he was committed to, with this budget, don't know what it was, but he was committed to sticking to that budget, and every other dime that he made was going to be given away for the rest of his career. Now you might say, well, that guy's a physician. Of course he could do that. It does. The principle still applies. Mm-hmm. Doesn't really matter what what your income level is. So I think for him, he displayed for me not just generosity, but that his whole family was bought into the idea, and there was I actually saw it really kind of leak into his kids' life. One of them in particular, I got to spend a lot of time with. And she picked up this shrewdness, I think, with her money. The other example that came to mind, I think this is just kind of a fun story, is a church that I knew of, that I know of, was built in a residential area. So there's houses all around, and it was built just kind of smack dab in the middle, and it was built on a little bit of a hill. So picture a church on a little bit of a hill, and the rest of the 3-4 square miles around it were just residential. So all the coding was only for residential, which meant you couldn't build any tall buildings or anything like that. So if you stood really at kind of any point in this neighborhood and you looked towards the horizon, you could see the steeple of this church, which has its own kind of symbolism. You come to a town, whatever, steeples point you towards the church. But this church was built in the early 70s, something like that, I think. And the steeple was a part of the original design. And 15 years into the church's existence, I don't remember which company, I feel like it might have been Sprint, came to them and they said, hey, we're putting cell phone towers all over the area, and we cannot put one in this area, but your steeple reaches high enough. Can we put an antenna inside your steeple? And the church, you could say, well, that church shouldn't have, they don't get in bed with a private company, don't, get involved with them, whatever. Don't take their money. And they thought, well, here's an opportunity that we did not anticipate at all. And they entered into an agreement. They put the cell phone tower in the steeple, and they made a commitment. This was money that they were not expecting. They could have spent it on themselves, but they said, we're going to use every dime of this to support our missionaries. And I heard about this in the probably early 2000s, and I think at that point, they were getting a check every year for $500,000 or something like that. They had to do nothing. You didn't see it at all. It was all built into the steeple. And so they were able to write checks every year. Shrewdness. They could have built more buildings, which wouldn't have been, in itself a wrong thing to do. But I think it was sweet to even see a church being thoughtful in that moment to take this thing that was just, not expected or planned, and to not even make it a part of their budget and just give it away.
Yeah, that's cool.
I thought that was cool.
Let me read this quote, and then I want to ask you a question. We'll kind of bring this to an end. But I just love this quote. This is from a pastor named John Piper. He says that this is the best way that I know how to capture the spirit of the New Testament generosity. It's to simply say this, that the issue is not how much must I give, but how much dare I keep. Not shall I tithe, but how much of the money that I hold in trust as a manager for Christ can I take for my private use? The financial issue in the church today is not tithing, but exorbitance of lifestyle. The question is not if you can afford to give, but can you justify the lifestyle that consumes 90% of your income? It says, behind that is this question: do I love to use God's money to spread justice and mercy and spiritual hope in the world? Or do I prefer to embezzle his money to purchase more and more personal comfort? And I thought that quote captured really what was going on with this manager and this. So here's the question I want to end on: is ask you, how do we get there, right? How do you, because we've just laid set a very high bar, and Jesus does that all the time. He says, here's kind of what I expect of you as my followers, but how do we get there? How do we do it? Where's the gospel come in, and how is the message not just, well, suck it up, try harder? What's the gospel motivation that makes us joyful givers, joyful managers, shrewd managers?
That's the easiest question I've gotten all day. Well, man, I would say I jotted down just kind of two ideas. I think the first is we have to stop looking for our happiness in our earthly possessions, and that's its own kind of spiritual journey. And when I think we talk about it a lot here, and certainly from the pulpit in our preaching, so you have to stop looking in all the wrong places for happiness. And I would say, we want our kids to understand this. We teach this to teenagers, but I do think it's a certain part of adulthood, and it takes some adults longer than others. They acquire enough stuff, and they get late enough in life where they finally realize, oh yeah, I've been chasing something that's just elusive. I'm never going to find it here. So I think we have to just kind of acknowledge the search that we're on, and that we're searching in the wrong places. But then I think it's not just that. It's not just acknowledging my happiness is not going to be found in my earthly possessions. It's going to be found in my relationship with Jesus. But then I think we also just need to learn how to trust God each day after that, because it's going to mean giving up a lot of the things that we are not only comfortable with, but maybe things that some stuff's easy to say we can live without, but there's times in my family where I just think, I am trusting God each month. Our bills are paid, we have groceries, but yet there's a whole kind of list of calamities that could come into my life, and I'm trusting that God's either going to protect my family from those things, or if it does happen, He's going to provide what's necessary. And so in that sense, to participate in God's kingdom in this way is not just, it's not how we think about or handle our things. It really is just, I think, a spiritual act of trust.
Yeah.
And then I think just being honest with ourselves each day too, there's a spiritual battle happening in our lives, and just acknowledging that I think is important. So I'd say stop looking in the wrong places and trust God.
That's good. And I was looking, and I'm so close here and can't quite land on it. That where Paul says, for you know the generosity of our God, of Christ. There it is. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. That Jesus is not just our ultimate example in this. That's what he did. He was rich and he became poor for our sakes, but it's also then that his action in doing that and giving up his life and is then the motivation and the empowerment, the gospel power that we need to do the same, to realize that we're rich, that we have his riches, we have his righteousness, so we can be free and give and not, like you said, not look in all these wrong places, but trust God. Okay, so got a live audience again for this class, and curious if any one of you have any questions about something we said.
There's a mic that's going to be coming around if...
does anyone want to ask a question? No pressure, you don't have to. But if something you just like, I thought, I want to know more about that, or I just want to clarify that. Yeah.
Thanks.
I still don't understand it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't understand how the master benefited from the shrewd manager's reduction of income, and also verse 8 and 9. It said the master commended the dishonest manager for acting shrewdly. The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings.
Yeah.
I don't see, if God is the master, I don't see how God was glorified in the reduction of his riches. Does that make sense?
I think that, so a couple things. I don't think we'll be able to answer all of those, probably, because I think those are some of the hardest parts of the story. But if I understand the last part of your question there, I think the comparison stops between God as the master in that part of the story. So yes, God would not be pleased to know that we were mishandling anything he'd been given, no matter where, no matter what the circumstances. So yes, the comparison stops there. There is, I did a little bit of reading on this today in preparation for this. There's a couple different options of why he could have been okay with that, but none of them really seem to make a ton of sense. It seems like that's where I feel like maybe the modern parable is the most helpful, although it's not the Bible, is that he realized perhaps he had long-term renters now, a more kind of stable relationship with these renters by reducing their rent for the coming period. Maybe he's earned their business now for the next 15. It was a long-term investment for him, something like that. But that to get caught up on that is actually, that's not the point of the story. But I really appreciate you asking, because it's confusing. It's hard to know. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's what I would have said. Yep. Ditto.
You're going first on the next one,
Yep.
and I'll just. Yeah.
I echo what he said.
Yeah.
It's the Christian way of saying it.
Yeah.
Any other questions that you guys have? Thought?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
As you guys said in the beginning, this is a parable that's kind of tough for people to understand, and that question, I think, amplifies that. One thing that I found interesting about this parable, as to some of the others that we talk about, in some of the others, the disciples kind of pull Jesus aside and say, hey, what did you mean by that? Mm-hmm. On this one, they didn't do that. Now, I don't know if that means that they instinctively got it, and how is it that they got it, but we're not getting it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good, and that's where I think the context really helps. So, what I would say is, I think hopefully, with what we've said and with watching the video, you can go back and watch it again. But then, really, if you're going to meditate and really kind of soak in something, go and read those verses that follow the parable. So those are the places where Jesus is kind of giving you what it means, and the disciples don't ask that, but he essentially does that, and talks about, here's what you should take away from this. So that would be a good exercise for you this week, is to just read and reread and even try to memorize some of those verses that follow this parable.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective about the disciples and them getting it and us not. But I also think you maybe assume too much of the disciples, because we have accounts, in Jesus' final hours of money being more important than him. So perhaps it kind of made sense to them, but it hadn't settled in.
Yeah. All right. Okay, well, again, to those of you who are watching this online, please interact on the discussion board that's underneath the video, and that's a place where you can share what you learned. You can ask questions. We're trying to go on there and answer any questions you have, or just a way for you to interact. And then next week we'll be back again with another parable, and we'll continue on.
Great.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks guys. Have a good night.